Okay. Video 2 on our series on how VCE works is on a concept called statistical moderation. And the idea of statistical moderation is that imagine you're a student who's deciding what school to go to for VCE. You might decide on a number of factors like where your friends go and how good the teaching is and all the different subjects they offer. But one you might consider is, well, does one of them have really easy SACs? Could I maybe get a really good score that way? Or do they have really hard SACs and maybe they'll get bumped up really high? And so statistical moderation is the way that the VCAA has of comparing SACs between schools so that it shouldn't matter which school you go to. You should be able to get the same grade for the same work regardless of what school you go to. Whether that's possible or not, we'll see, but that's the idea and that's the problem we're trying to solve here. So to understand this, we're actually going to do a bit of a thought experiment of imagining sort of almost one person going to 3 different schools. So let's consider 3 schools: Hardmark High, Suzanne Corey High School, and Easy Street Community College. And you can imagine that those 3 schools might have 3 very different marking policies. Maybe Hardmark High sets incredibly hard SACs, and they think that's the best way to prepare their kids. Suzanne Corey High School, of course, sets reasonable SACs because we're all reasonable people here. And Easy Street Community College sets really straightforward SACs because they want their students to get nearly 100% on everything. So 3 different philosophies there, and you might think which is the best one, which is going to get the best mark at VCE level. So what we're going to do is we're going to consider 3 triplets who attend each of these schools, and they're all equally intelligent and equally hardworking and all that sort of thing. We're also not going to consider that these schools have different facilities and different teaching and different resources. They're all going to be the same, just the assessment's different. Okay. So we're going to consider our 3 identical triplets. We've got Horace, Susie, and Ethel. And Horace goes to Hardmark, and Susie goes to Suzanne Corey, and Ethel goes to Easy Street. People say they look similar, but they can't see the resemblance. So our 3 triplets are going to go to these 3 schools, and they're going to get some grades. And here's the distribution of SAC scores at their schools in a particular subject. Let's say this is their English class. Ethel, who goes to Easy Street, is getting like 95% on all her SACs. She's doing really well. Although on the other hand, she's kind of a little bit below the average for her school. It's worth taking a little bit of time to think about what these graphs mean. Each of these little boxes here represents 25% of the students at a school. So at Hardmark High, the sort of lowest performing student is getting about 10% on their SACs. The 25th percentile student is getting about 25. The median student, about 35. The 3/4 up the way of the scale student is getting a bit over 40, and then their very, very top student is only getting sort of 55%. So they really are living up to their name. So that's how to read these boxes here. And you see Ethel, she's getting 95%, but she's actually a little bit below the median for Easy Street High. At Hardmark High, Horace is in the sort of the top quartile of his year level, even though he's only getting 43%. Those SACs must be really hard. And at Suzanne Corey, we've got a big long distribution of scores, obviously all the way from sort of really not getting very much out of 100 to all the way getting sort of some people who are almost getting 100% on these SACs. And Susie's sort of somewhere in the middle. She's getting sort of 65, 70%. So you can see 3 completely different philosophies these schools have towards their SACs. Easy Street is making it really straightforward to get in those top marks. Almost everybody's getting above 90%. Hardmark High, almost nobody's getting above 60%, and at Suzanne Corey, we've got a bit of a spread. And we might want to ask, well, who's done better here? Has Ethel done better? Has Horace done better? Has Susie done better? Which one of them has actually worked harder? Well, we might ask how they go on their exams. But let's assume they all get the same exam mark. We've already said that they're identical twins. They're kind of working just as hard as one another. So the only question is, how good was their work on their SACs for the year? And we don't really know. If we look back at that graph, it's really hard to compare Horace's SAC mark to Ethel's and to say who really did better. I mean, sure, Ethel got 95% and Horace got 45%, but they were working on completely different tasks. So how do we solve that problem? We'll look at a few different options that you might consider. One is you could just leave them. You could just give people the grade that they got. Well, which school would you want to go to in that scenario? I mean, I think it's pretty clear that if you just left the scores as is, you would clearly want to go to Easy Street. Because Ethel, who remember is no smarter than Horace and Susie, is getting great marks at Easy Street just because the SACs are really easy. So we really can't just leave the scores as is. Right? We can't just assume that because it's not true. It's clear that the SACs at Easy Street are easier. So option 2 would be only to look at relative performance within your cohort. So if we go back to their marks on that previous page, yeah, Horace is only getting 45%, but he's in the top quartile. And Susie is in the sort of the third quartile, and Ethel is actually a little bit below average for Easy Street. So we could just completely normalize all the scores, set them all to the same baseline, and just say, where are you in your cohort? And I've done that with some numbers, and let's run some numbers again. And in this case, it turns out that Horace gets the highest score. He gets 74 out of 100. Susie gets 68, and Ethel gets 55. And that's just based on the fact that relative to his cohort, Horace has done a little bit better. Whereas Susie's sort of in the third quartile and Ethel's in the second. But that's not really fair either, because we don't know that these cohorts are exactly the same. Well, I mean, we would actually expect that the Suzanne Corey High School students are actually going to be a better performing cohort. So maybe Susie's performance of being in that third quartile is actually more impressive than Horace's as being in the top of his. Or maybe Easy Street's a really high performing school, and actually Ethel's done even better than anybody else, and maybe their SACs aren't even that easy. It's just that everyone's great, and that's why they're all getting above 90%. So it's a hard problem. And the approach that the VCAA use is what I'm calling option 3 here, which is where we use the exam scores. So we don't just take those SACs as given, nor do we take the rankings of the students in those SACs as given. Instead, we look at how each of the cohorts of students, not the individual students themselves, the cohorts of students, we look at how well they've done overall on the exam, and we treat the exam as being the real decider of how good a cohort is. And then we're going to shift the SAC marks around until they sort of match the exam marks. And I've made a little video to show you what that looks like. So here we go. So here's their exam mark. This is Ethel here, and this is Horace, and this is Susie down here, and they've all got 81 on the exam, we said before. So there's no difference in how they've personally performed on the exams, but their cohorts have performed very differently. Easy Street and Hard Mark High have actually performed pretty similarly. They have medians that are sort of one's at 65-ish, one's at 68-ish. But the Suzanne Corey High School cohort, we've done much better. We were up at like 83% as our median for this subject. We're saying it's English or whatever it might be. On the other hand, Ethel's SAC score is all the way up here if it's completely unmoderated. If we just take it as read, that the SAC was, whatever it was. Horace's is all the way down here because his SACs are really hard, and Susie's is somewhere in the middle. And the process the VCAA use is, what they do is they take these distributions, let's watch Ethel's carefully, they take this distribution here and they match it to the exam distribution. And we'll see, when I hit play, that Ethel's mark moves relative to her cohorts. So let's watch. Stretching, 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 until this distribution matches this one, and then Ethel's mark just comes out wherever it ends up. So she keeps her relative position within the cohort. If we play that again from the start, she started sort of a little bit below the middle of her cohort, and she ends a little bit below the middle of her cohort. And her grades have been normalised back to however well her cohort did on the exam. The same thing's happened to Susie. Let's watch Susie now. So Susie starts off the SACs were a little bit harder. We did much better on the exam than we did on the SACs at Suzanne Corey. She's sort of a little bit above the middle for Suzanne Corey. So she ends up with a little bit above the middle mark on the exam, but more impressive than her original SAC mark because we all did really well on the exam. And similarly for Horace, Horace's raw score on the SACs is disastrous, but we all know that that's just because the SACs were really hard. And when they go into the exam, they do much better on that exam than they did on the SACs, and Horace's mark gets moved up along with the rest of his cohort. Now notice that there's also as well as the sort of the middle of that distribution moving around, there's also a stretching of the distribution. So it's fitting it to the same shape as the exam marks. Think about for a minute what that means about your cohort, about how you should behave within your cohort and what you're hoping for out of your fellow classmates. Back to the presentation now. So this is the final distribution we ended up with. And it turns out that Susie has actually done much better than Ethel and Horace. And obviously I've rigged the numbers so the Suzanne Corey student comes out on top here. But you can see that even though she didn't get the highest raw mark, nor was she the highest relative position within her cohort, what this system does is it simultaneously adjusts for how difficult your SACs were and also how strong your cohort of students that you're competing against is. And that's the purpose of statistical moderation. So, if we run the numbers one last time with option 3, what we find is that Susie has actually done a little bit better than Horace and Ethel because her statistically moderated SAC score has ended up a little bit higher. Overall, that means her total score, which is just her SAC score plus her exam score. Sometimes there's a weighted average here. One might be worth 40 and 160 or 33, 67. But somehow or another they're added together, and eventually that gets turned into a study score. And presentation 1 will talk about how that happens. And of course, Susie ends up with a slightly higher study score because they had the same exam scores. Now, notice that they just keep their own exam score. If Ethel had got 90 on the exam, she'd have got 9 extra marks here. Nothing about your exam score gets moved around through this process, only your SAC scores. Okay, so there's a few morals that come out of this. One is, don't worry if your SACs seem really hard, or if they seem really easy, because it's all going to come out in the wash when the exams come through. Horace ended up with a better mark than Ethel, even though he had much lower raw percentages on his SACs. All that really mattered was Horace's relative place in his cohort, and then how well his cohort did. The second moral is that you really want to help each other out. Susie ends up doing much better than Horace and Ethel, not because her relative position was better, and not because her percentage on each SAC was better, but because her overall cohort did so well that her relative position looked really good. And the last thing I want to point out is that you really want to work evenly across all your subjects. I'm going to go into that in a little bit of detail now. So the question is, should you concentrate on your top 4? And it seems pretty intuitive that you should at first blush. Only 4 subjects count, as this gentleman here says, and so he should focus on the 4 that he's best at. But his friend says, how do you know which 4 you're best at? And his response presumably would be, well, it's maths, chemistry, and English, obviously. But I would argue, and hopefully his friend would argue too, that he doesn't actually know. And I want to show you what that looks like. So I think intuitively, we think that our estimates of our scores look something like this. Maybe you did biology in year 11, so that one's kind of locked in. You're definitely getting that 41. Well done. And you kind of think that you're going to get maybe a 35 in media and a 36 in methods and a 42 in HHD and a 41 in global and a 39 in English or whatever it might be for you. But that guess really is just your best guess. And if you think about it, there's a lot that can go wrong with that guess. One is you might just think you're good at maths because everybody else in your class doesn't seem as good as you, but maybe everyone's not that good. You might think that you're really good at global because the SACs have been easy. You might think that you're really good at HHD because your teacher really likes you and keeps on telling you how great you are. You might think you're terrible at media, but maybe your cohort of students is actually just brilliant. And you just look around and you're seeing all these brilliant people and you think you're not as good. All this information is just feeding into giving you a sense of how you're going to go, but you don't really know. And then on top of that, there's just a randomness in what's going to come up on the exam. How are you going to go on that day? How are you going to feel that morning? Have you studied that particular question in a lot of detail that happens to come up on that one exam? How's the examiner who marks it? How are they feeling? How many coffees have they had for the morning? Fundamentally, there's a range of possibilities for each subject. You don't know what you're going to get. You've just got you might have a broad sense, but at best you can get a sort of range. And maybe in some subjects there's a bigger range than others. Maybe in a subject like media, you're really not sure what you're going to get. Whereas in a subject like HHD, you might really have a clear sense of, well, I know this, I can't get any less than that. So what we get is a series of ranges of possible marks. And you're going to, depending on how lucky you get on the day, and depending on a whole bunch of different factors, you're going to get somewhere in that range. So now this idea of the top 4 starts to look a little bit shaky. Because media, which in this example is your lowest guess subject, there's some possibility that you actually blitz it and you hit it out of the park. And there's some possibility that you do really badly in global politics. Still not particularly badly, by the way. You're still getting high 30s, so you're a pretty brilliant student. But the point is, there's always some uncertainty here. And actually, there's probably going to be one subject in your top 4 that you don't expect to be there. So it would be a real shame if you were to give up on that subject early in the year and not put in the work to push this range up to where it needs to be. So my advice for you is, you might think you know your top 4, but you really don't. So those are our 3 morals. Don't worry if your SACs seem too hard, too easy, whatever. It'll all come out in the wash. Help each other out. You want to make sure your cohort is all ready on the day of the exam. And try and work evenly across your subjects where you can. Thank you.